What's up, everybody? You're watching Model Aviator. I'm Adam, and we are here with my buddy Dustin Jenton once again with his Freewing twin 64mm F-14 Tomcat. One of three that you've flown. You actually own two. You've got this one. You have a beater that you built from two crash ones that he got off of another guy, and then you set one up and helped Carl with his. Yep. So the reason I'm saying that, Dustin is able to fly these things successfully. You've discovered some things about the airplane. You've read where a lot of people are having some issues with the plane, and you just thought that you could maybe help and offer up some things that might answer a lot of questions, help some people out with this airplane. So that is why we're here again, and you're seeing a release midweek, not on a Friday. We just wanted to bring this to you, hopefully to help those of you that have this airplane. So Dustin, take it away. What's the first thing you want to talk about?
All right, we're just going to go through the list of some common issues that I've seen on the internet and I know a little bit about. The first one is I know some people are saying the elevator stabilizer is backwards. So if instead of correcting upwards, it'll correct downwards. That's a fix that Motion mentioned. Apparently, some of them come with the two elevator wires plugged in backwards to the stabilizer board. So if that happens, it's fairly simple. You just switch the plugs for the two elevator wires. Easy fix as long as you know to do that. I personally wouldn't have thought to do that, but if you know, it's easy. I've heard and seen several videos of people that have the wing sweep at different times, or they get stuck, and that usually seems to lead to a crash, understandably. A couple people, I have not personally had that issue, I should clarify. But a few people I've seen on the internet came up with a couple solutions to that, and I thought they're worth repeating. One of them is that when these wings come back, there's a plate here that if these flaps are down very far at all, or if that plate is bent, it can jam. So the wings will either refuse to come forward or refuse to go backwards. And when it does that, one wing will most likely refuse to go. So make sure your flap hinges are intact. Make sure the control horn hasn't fallen off or anything. That's I've heard someone had that issue. Also, if you're taking this off from grass, which I think manicured grass is probably okay, but rough grass may not be the best idea for this airplane. If you damage the gear significantly, the main gear will punch upwards a little bit and actually bend the gear plate. And when that happens, it could very well jam the wing. I know there's one YouTuber that actually saw that happen on his airplane and actually landed it somehow and was able to go in and get a video of the gear plates being bent after he'd taken off from grass. So that's something to watch out for. This thing, as you'll see in my video, unfortunately does handle some fairly hard landings with no problem. But if you get it too far, it's something worth checking to make sure these landing gear reinforcement plates have not gotten bent. Otherwise, it may jam the wings.
So just to interject really quickly, so if somebody really smacks this thing down hard on a landing and you go around, just leave the wings where they are and get it down before you do anything and check that.
Yep, and I always check the wing sweep, whether I plan to use it or not, just to make sure everything functions. Really, with any flight, you should be moving all your services, making sure everything works before you take off. And really, back to my first point, same thing with the elevator. It is possible that if this elevator stabilizer direction wasn't caught before the first flight, it could be a major issue. So be sure your stabilizer is going the right direction before you take off. That could be a critical failure. There are people speculating that some of the ball joints are coming off the servos that make the wing sweep. I haven't seen that issue. I don't think it's going to be common in that that's the same sort of linkages that hold all the other surfaces, including the big surfaces in the back here. That being said, you could certainly get some ball links that have the screw in them, so it's positively retained if you're worried about that. That's always an option. And I guess the last one that I've personally seen, which was I think kind of a fluke, but it did happen, so I'll talk about it. The two airplanes that Adam refers to that I collectively made one out of, one of the reasons one of those crashed was because one of the fans actually came off on takeoff and shot forward. And I've got a picture of it. It really did happen. When I got the airplane, the fan was wedged somewhere about here in the duct. I've never seen that on any EDF in my life. I reattached it to the EDF on mine, and it's been doing fine. I've probably flown it 20 times since then. So I don't know why that happened, but it did. So it is theoretically possible. That did cause the crash because it was a really asymmetric thrust on takeoff, which makes sense. when I first made in that airplane, after I put it back together, I had like a whole one engine checklist in my head for what I was going to do if that happened. Luckily I didn't have to, but my thought was reduce power as quick as you can. Where I fly, it's very tall grass, so I was going to go ahead and sweep the wings, just make it where it wouldn't break the wing when I landed, and get the gear up. And then I was going to try ditching the field if I had that situation. Again, I don't think that's very common, but I did see it happen, so I'll mention it. It was interesting, if nothing else, I guess. And there's a couple other few issues I've seen that I don't know that I know enough to comment on. There's been some people complaining about various things, the stabilizer. I haven't had any experience with that, so I'm not going to go any farther into that one. Mine's been working great on the stock settings using the Freewing stabilizer. But yeah, that's kind of my list of just general issues with the airplane.
Gotcha. Okay, very cool.
Another thing we've seen on the internet quite a lot is that this plane is hard to land. I can't say it's the easiest plane I have to land. It definitely takes some technique, and I mess it up often enough. It flies fantastic, but it is going to take some practice to land it pretty every time. A couple tips to make that happen. You really need to keep speed on this airplane. You can't just cut the power and come around the corner and glide it in. I normally keep about half throttle all the way around the final turn. And then if I'm going downhill real steep, sometimes I'll go back to idle or like 10 or 15%. But as soon as I start to pull the nose back up, I roll power back in. Usually 30 to 40% power on the final approach. You also can't fly at a high angle of attack down low with the gear down, the flaps down. So you come in, roll it about level, kind of fly at level, let it sink a little bit, but don't do any kind of dramatic high alpha descent like you might with a different jet. This one's not going to handle it. So fly level, give it a little bit of power, get it level over the runway, and right when you're about ready to land a foot or so off the ground, that's when I start thinking about really trying to flare and pull the power back to idle. And that's kind of just a timing thing. You got to get the timing right. It doesn't happen the first try. It doesn't happen the 30th try all the time. But it can certainly be done. And it's just something that takes a little bit of finesse and a little bit of practice to do. But I think the key is just power on. Don't let it get slow. Don't try to get into high alpha with it. When you get the flaps down on this jet, it will lose speed pretty quickly. So you do have to have power in it. Otherwise, it's going to be a problem.
Gotcha. So we have a couple of videos that we're going to play for you now of Dustin flying it. He's going to do a little bit of narration. He does some tight turns. There's two flights. One is with the wings out, and the second flight is from takeoff to landing with the wings swept. And Dustin will talk in the video a little bit about how the airplane handles with the wings swept and some of the differences there. So check these videos out, and we'll come back here and answer some frequently asked questions. And Dustin's got a couple of aerodynamic things to talk about. He is an aeronautical engineer by trade, so dude knows what he's talking about. And one thing to point out, on this day, Dustin was not having his best day. I've seen Dustin land this airplane smoothly time and time and time again. He doesn't put a scratch on it, but it wasn't your best day, to be fair, and it was windy, so a lot of this is how not to mess up when you mess up. So check this out.
Alright, so the first couple turns we're going to do a full elevator turns with just about full power to see if the wings drop or not. You see it does get a little unstable after you hold the elevator in for a couple seconds there. Wing drops a little bit and then it just kind of starts flopping around, which is typical, if not a little bit better than a lot of other heavy jets. I still don't recommend using a full up elevator in turns on this because I do think it's a little bit of a risk. Again, just like any other high wing loading RC airplane, you gotta be gentle on the turns. The loop you saw a minute ago was not full elevator for that reason. I don't want to drop a wing at the bottom of a loop. And we'll start doing some landing approaches here. on that one. I hit a little bit harder than I should have and bounced it a little bit higher than I would have liked. Knowing that the second touchdown is always a lot harder than the first one, I went ahead and gave it full power, and it has enough power to go around and try again. Had I held that out, it probably would have gotten even slower and higher and then stalled and dropped a wing. So if you get in that situation, if you have enough battery left, go around. A little bit of bounce there, but it's down in one piece. Now for these landings, I am trying to come in with 30 to 40% power at least on the final approach. And I'll normally keep about half power around the turn to final. If you're going downhill real steep, you can idle it for a second, but with the flaps down, you do not want to let it glide too long anywhere near level. It slows down fast. Timing the flare on this one is kind of critical to landing pretty, and it is not the easiest thing in the world. You can't flare a ton on this airplane. If you flare too much, it will try to climb and stall on you pretty much immediately. So keep it as level as you can on that final approach. Give just a little bit of flare toward the end, and it should work out. One other thing I did is I have reverse thrust on here, and I've mixed my flaps to retract as soon as I hit the reverse thrust to prevent the bubbling. Try to fly a fairly quick, gentle turn in, and then keep the power on down low. That one floated a little more than I thought it would, but it ended up landing just fine. You have a little bit of airspeed. It takes off just fine with the wings back. Pretty stable on the climb out. We're going to go and do a couple full elevator turns here. The first one and the second one coming up here. The airplane is remarkably stable given full aft stick deflection in a turn with the wings back. We'll come around here and do a full elevator loop. I hit full elevator about the time I got vertical on that loop and held it all the way until the loop was over. And again, it seemed completely stable the whole way around. Plenty of power to do a loop with it. And we'll do another one here just for good measure. We're going to turn around here and then come back and do a full aileron roll at full speed to give you an idea how fast it rolls. It is pretty quick with the wings back with full speed up. I have the stock set up from Freewing, basically what Wesley had recommended for the rates. And we'll start setting up for a wing swept landing here as well. Wasn't my finest, but you can see it would have gotten down. I kind of second guessed whether I was going around or not, which is why the reverse thrust came on and off a few times there. When you're trying to land this with the wings back, you have to basically get it into a high alpha configuration and then kind of fly it down with power. very similar to how you might land like the 70 millimeter F-16 in a high alpha configuration. It does take some power once you get slow though. See there, I got a gust of wind and was slow and it about rolled me over, but luckily this plane does have enough power to punch out of that pretty easily, so I just went full power and went around. And the next one I believe was a little better. Kind of get in the high alpha configuration there, slowing down a bit, letting it drop, then rolling power back in right about there. It does want to wheelie a lot with the wings back, especially once you put the reverse thrust on, but it's overall handles pretty well, in my opinion, for that.
So there we have it with the flying. One thing I will say, I was amazed at how well this thing flies with the wings swept. It's just really not a big deal, is it?
No, it flies great. I was kind of terrified to do it at first, but it's I think it's really a mental thing. It flies excellent once you get used to it.
Very cool. So anything you want to talk about the flying or the setup before you get into the frequently asked questions?
Yeah, sure. I'll follow up, because I don't think I hit it completely earlier, but on the first video, I said something that I completely disagree with now. I said I ignored the flat mixing to the elevator. After doing a couple more landings, I found that it really does help to have some nose down elevator programmed in when the flaps come down. It's basically the difference of having to push the nose down slightly off and on and having it kind of neutrally trimmed versus my preference of having a slight nose down trim so that you're always having to pull back just a little bit, just because it is so sensitive to the angle of attack coming in. And I'd rather be only pulling one direction on the stick and just holding it that way versus going up and down and trying to find the balance point. That has helped a good bit once I got a little bit of nose down trim into it.
Right, and I want to point out really quickly, not to interrupt you, but at the very end of this video, we're going to have a setup page like we do in reviews. That's how it will end. It will be Dustin's setup on this airplane, so you can check that out if you'd like to duplicate what he's doing exactly. So go ahead with your frequently asked questions.
I'll do one more thing on the landing. I think I mentioned it briefly in the narration, but if you bounce this thing and it looks like it's going to bounce more than about an inch, just go around. It's not worth it.
Yep.
It will inevitably go up about 3 feet and drop a wing. It has enough power that it will go around and it will do it, and it shouldn't give you a problem as long as you're on it. But you see at one point in the video I did the same thing. I've not done that before, and it's dropped a wing and landed a lot harder than what you saw in the video. So yeah, just don't try to save it, just go around.
And interestingly enough, all those landings, well, I mean, those are the hardest landings I've seen you. Like I said, Dustin usually greases this thing every time, but you haven't bent the gear yet, even with those landings.
Agreed.
So to bend that gear, you really got to smack it pretty hard, don't you?
Yeah, agreed. I've been pretty impressed with. Again, I haven't put it in incredibly, but I have landed it harder than I'd like to admit and bounced it around and spun around a time or two here and there. And yeah, the gear's perfectly intact. So I've been very impressed with that.
Okay.
So as far as a couple things, the thing I get asked every single time I go to the field on this is it go faster with the wings back? And the answer, it may be like 1 or 2 mile an hour faster just because it's a little bit less drag. But in theory, no, it should not be faster. For my own curiosity, and if anyone's interested in this sort of thing, like the reason you sweep wings on an airplane is the most inefficient thing you can possibly do at anything under a compressible airflow regime, i.e. about 400 mile an hour. The only reason the wings sweep back is to allow compressible flow, which is as you approach the transonic and the supersonic airspeeds. Main reason being that in a wing like this, there's going to be a supersonic shock wave coming off the front. You want the wings to be behind that when you're flying fast. Otherwise, you'll have different pressures on either side of the shock wave. If that line goes across your wing, you're going to have all kinds of problems structurally, aerodynamically, everything else. So the other main reason you see, like for example, airliners have swept wings. They don't have a shock wave coming off the front of the airplane, but there's a point called the critical Mach number where the airflow across the wing actually goes supersonic locally, even though the airplane's not going supersonic. And at that point, just because of the thickness of the wing, we all know the air accelerates as it goes across the top of the wing. as it accelerates, a small shock wave will come straight up off the wing. And by sweeping the wing backwards, you end up making the relative shape of the wing a lot longer and skinnier, so it delays the onset of that shock wave. So you can fly faster before you get this normal shock coming off the top of the wing, which is why you see airliners do that. And if you ever look closely and pay attention enough, you can actually see the shock wave on the airliner occasionally. If you're sitting right over the wing, you'll see shadows bouncing back and forth at cruise, and that probably is a normal shock wave that you can just barely make out. It happened to me once, and I thought it was incredible. So
that is very interesting. What an education. So basically, you're talking 400 miles an hour faster, which airliners are faster than 400 miles an hour. On a model like this that's doing 100 and some change, just not a thing.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at like the Hotliner RC airplanes, that's the most efficient way to fly at these speeds. Really long, really high aspect ratio wing, very skinny. Delta wings do give you a better high angle of attack flight characteristics, which is one reason you probably saw in that video. This, when it goes back, it sort of, I think, starts functioning a bit as a delta wing, and it does do high alpha a lot better. But as far as speed and aerodynamics, you would be way better to have a long skinny wing at these airspeeds.
Gotcha.
And actually, this is one of the things, if you look up like the Saber dance, for example, that's one of the downsides of having a wing like this or a swept wing at low speeds. It actually does a lot of really negative things to the airplane, as far as the low speed and stall characteristics when you have a proper swept wing.
Very cool. So now that we've nerded out, what else do you have?
I think that's about it, honestly.
Really?
Is there anything else I need to cover that I haven't?
Basically, just to sum this up, one thing that we haven't mentioned, and I'm going to mention it because it's the hard thing to say. You don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. I have to do this when I do a review. I have to say what type of pilot the airplane is for. We said this in the first video. I'm going to reiterate again. This is not a novice's jet. This is not a first EDF. It might not even be a second or third EDF. It depends on what you've flown. A lot of sport jets fly much easier than this. Yeah. And this really takes a unique skill set that you have to have some experience and understand how the airplane works to fly this well, don't you?
Yeah, agreed. Particularly on landing. In the air, I find it not terrible, but it definitely has traps. I don't think it's any more difficult in the air than, say, like my 90mm T-45. It's also a big heavy jet. Mm-hmm. I've actually crashed that one for some of the issues I'm talking about, where I got too slow in a turn. But yeah, it shouldn't be the first airplane, shouldn't be the first EDF. It's not a trainer EDF. It does take a little bit of skill and a little bit of kind of respect for the higher wing loading airplane.
Right. And so there are people out there, I think, that are having issues with this airplane, and the primary reason is probably because they are just simply are not up to this particular EDF. You may be really good with a Viper or a Futura. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily ready for this unless you've flown high wing loading scale airplanes before, particularly jets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
right?
Agreed.
Yep. All right. Well, Dustin, man, thanks for doing this. Hopefully, a lot of what Dustin said will help some of you, maybe answer some questions about this airplane. We're going to put the setup, and by the setup, I mean Dustin's setup on this airplane. You're going to see next. Take care of yourselves. Happy flying. Dustin, thank you, brother.
Thank you.
Take it easy.